To the extent that we live our lives in a manner that is consistent with the truth in our heart, we thrive.
Welcome to the Meyer Clinics podcast, and you just heard a quote from one of your hosts, Dr. Lisa Day. Join our licensed clinical professionals from various backgrounds as they discuss fascinating mental health topics with a wide range of guests. Meyer Clinics is a Christian counseling organization with multiple clinics nationwide dedicated to treating the whole person, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Welcome to our listening family. We thank you for joining us. Hey everyone, Kristen Walker here, and I am with Dr. Lisa Day on the Meyer Clinics podcast. Hello, Lisa.
Hi, Kristen.
So last week we talked about healing the wounds of growing up with a narcissistic mother, and this time we're going to talk about how growing up with a narcissistic mother affects your attachment style. This is going to be really fascinating for me, so please take the mic.
You betcha. So when we think about attachment, or when we think about narcissism, we think about all of their grandiosity, and we think about all of their self-absorption and egotistical, difficulties and challenges. But really, when we think about narcissism, we want to think about destructive dynamics and attachments with others. And it's my opinion that all narcissists have attachment problems and make lousy parents. So looking at, how that attachment or lack of attachment affects how we attach in both our friendships and our romantic relationships and our family relationships is important, as we continue on the journey of healing.
Absolutely. And it can even affect our relationships with our pets and relationships with things in our life like furniture, or it's just attachment period to anything that it can affect.
Well, in the concept of attachment or attachment theory has been around for years. I think the original study started in the 50s or 60s with Bowlby, and then there were some more famous studies later on in the 70s with a researcher by the name of Mary Ainsworth. But they did some fascinating studies with young children, 1, 2, I think 2 was the oldest. And, I won't go into the depth of those research studies, but some of the results are really powerful. And, what they found is that the healthy attached children were far more likely to be adventurous, to be thrill seekers, to seek experiences that were intriguing, enlightening, and interesting, whereas the children who were less attached were less adventurous, less interested in venturing out beyond their comfort zone, and significantly affecting the research studies. And so as studies went on, what we have found is that people who struggle with insecure attachments oftentimes are so wrapped up in their bad feelings and their lack of knowing self that they have great difficulty, embarking upon new adventures. And so what I want to look at today is to look at how attachment styles and growing up with a narcissistic mom affect those attachment styles. And when we think about it, attachment styles, across the psychological literature, oftentimes you'll hear people talk about really 4 main types of attachment styles. And ideally, we fall here, but most of us don't. And that would be in the secure attachment style, which when we look at the non-clinic population, it's a large percentage. It's 55 to 65%. But of course, those folks aren't coming to therapy because they likely are having more fruitful interactions. But a secure attachment style is someone who, basically speaking, has a positive view of themselves, and they have a positive view of others. And so they've learned to trust themselves and to trust others, or they've experienced healthy intimacy. They've experienced healthy affection. They've developed a sense of self, and they've learned to develop a sense of respect for other people's self, and not necessarily seeing it as threatening, to self. But so we've got the secure attachment style. But then we go into the ones that I want to focus on today, that all 3 of them result from a variety of parenting, but narcissistic parenting being one of the strongest influences in the development of these. And we have what is called an anxious attachment, or an anxious preoccupied attachment. We have an avoidant attachment, but it's avoidant dismissive, and I'll go into that in a moment. And then we have an avoidant fearful. And so if we look at attachment, most of the theorists believe that attachment styles are formed by the time a child is 3 years old. I believe differently. I think that a lot of it is formed by the time that they're 3, but as we've talked about in our previous shows, throughout our childhood development, there's lots of opportunity to be hurt, to experience neglect, abandonment, lack of validation, lack of acknowledgement. And so I think that our attachment style is certainly influenced by the time that we're 3, but I think it's continually influenced throughout our development. And so looking at, how, our mother affected that is huge as we continue in our growth process. And one of the most popular, I think, that I would see in the insecure attachment styles is the anxious attachment style. And, Kristen, as we've talked in the previous shows, if we don't know who we are, what our feelings are, our thoughts are, our beliefs, and we're not validated in that, when we enter into a relationship, we struggle. And so when we think about an anxious attachment style, that individual has a negative view of themselves. They don't know who they are. They don't know what they like or what they don't like. They don't know what they desire and what they don't desire. So they have a negative view of themselves, but they have this positive, maybe artificially inflated view of others. And obviously coming from that dynamic between the narcissistic mom and the dependent child. And it can be a very challenging dynamic. And one who has an anxious attachment style is obviously uncomfortable. They want closeness, but they're fearful, of other people. They are concerned that they're not going to be valued. They think that they feel more for the other person than the other person feels for them. Unfortunately, this kind of dynamic often creates a tremendous imbalance because they need constant reassurance. They want a higher level of intimacy than perhaps their partner is willing to be a part of. They need, constant responsiveness. People with an anxious attachment style are only comfortable oftentimes when in proximity, to their attachment figure. And so the anxiety leads to a tremendous amount of emotional dysregulation. Folks with an anxious attachment style worry a lot. They perseverate a lot, meaning they focus without, really a clear understanding of what that discomfort is related to. And they can be really impulsive. They can be cruel. They can be manipulative. They can be shaming in relationships in order for those attachment needs to be met.
Interesting. I can resonate with that, with some aspects of that for sure.
Well, and when you think of it, growing up with a narcissistic mom who didn't see you, as a child, when we come into this world, we desire that connection and attachment. And mom's our primary nurturing source, right? Her main goal is to contain our chaos. And if we look toward her to contain our chaos, and yet she is the source of our chaos, we have no sense of security of knowing where we end and where she begins, if we're going to be valued, if we're going to be abandoned, if we're going to be rejected.
Right. So, it was my job to contain her chaos, believe me. That was my job.
How anxious did that? And so how anxious did that, make you as a child, walking on the eggshells?
Absolutely. Walking on eggshells. Yep.
Yeah, that burden, of having to carry the responsibility of another's emotions. It creates the fear, that cornerstone baseline fear. But what's interesting, when we think about the healing process, and, there's two different types of avoidant attachment styles, but what we often find, I'll explain the avoidant styles. So there's two main kinds of avoidant attachment styles. And when we walk through attachment styles, it's important that we're not looking at whether I have an anxious attachment style, an avoidant dismissive, or an avoidant fearful, so that we can label ourselves or necessarily see it as, some sort of pathology. But we want to look at the attachment styles to look at where might we fit. Because then it gives us a bit of an outline, if you will, or a path to look at where do we grow. Because in all of those attachment styles, be it the anxious attachment style or the two different avoidant attachment styles, ultimately we sabotage that which we desire, which is secure, loving attachment.
And would someone resonate with more than just one?
Oh, absolutely. And so I'll finish going through them. So, the two main avoidants are, the avoidant dismissive, and someone who's avoidant dismissive, they have a positive view of self, which is oftentimes reflective of that protection, that safety, that defense that you and I have talked about, that I'm not going to let you hurt me. I'm not going to let you have the power. And, as a young child, what I often see is that because I cannot turn off my feelings, I quickly learn to turn off my need. So if I need you to validate me and yet you judge and criticize, and that just derails me, punches me in the gut, in an effort not to feel that punch in the gut or to be derailed, I learn how to turn off my need. So I think, well, I need you to be kind, loving, and nurturing, and you're not. So intellectually or intellectualizing, I'm going to turn off that need. And what that young child does is grow up into an avoidant, develops an avoidant attachment style, but of the dismissive type. So they feel okay about themselves because they've got that strength. You can't touch me. I'm not going to let you hurt me. I'm not going to need you. I'm going to be compliant because if not, I might get my tail whooped. But I'm not going to let you have the power of knowing that you mean anything to me. And so, as an adult, that person, they have a positive view of themselves and a very negative view of others, meaning mom was dangerous. To need her meant I was going to be let down.
Interesting.
These people, they want closeness, but they're going to be, protective of it. So what they're going to look like is they're going to look like the person who has it all together. They're fiercely independent. They're self-sufficient. They prefer not to depend on others. While they want to be in proximity to others, they're going to do their best not to depend on them, not to have needs of them. They tend to have defensive qualities, such as, why are you so worried? I got this covered. I don't need your help. Back off.
Right.
Give me my space. They deal with, rejection by distancing themselves. As, oh, relationships are difficult. They're a pain. I have no time for that. And oftentimes those people will present themselves as workaholics, and they look incredibly successful as if they have it all together. But sadly, they are not able to address their nurturing needs. And so it shows up in other areas of their life.
Also resonate with that one.
And then the third one, then we can come back and look at where we all fit in these, is the avoidant fearful. And the avoidant fearful attachment style is they're unsure, and they're unsure of their view of self, and they're unsure of their view of others. So we struggle with, we've not quite done the healing work of growing up with a narcissist where we've identified our feelings and learned to develop boundaries. So we tend to look at where someone is and respond accordingly. But then we're also not sure that we trust where the other person is. And so it creates a tremendous amount of discomfort in relationships. We see this style particularly when there's sexual, physical, emotional abuse on top of the narcissistic parenting style. They want closeness, but they're fearful of it. They don't completely trust other people and certainly don't completely depend on them, and uncomfortable, with vulnerability or being humble. At the core of who they are, they see themselves as unworthy, and they don't trust the intentions of another person. They don't trust their ability to be there. And so, oftentimes we don't clearly fit into whether I have an anxious attachment style or a dismissive avoidant or a fearful avoidant, but I find it very helpful, for us to take a look at where might I fall into that place and where might that be sabotaging the things that I want in close intimacy with other people.
Right. Interesting. Maybe too, can people fall into those different attachment styles at different places in their healing journey?
Well, absolutely, but I don't know that it necessarily would be a healthy dynamic, meaning someone new, well, not even new into their healing. So perhaps in their adult life when they've separated from the narcissistic parent, and let's just say, for instance, they present as that anxious attached style, and that person tends to be experienced in relationship as fairly needy, fairly demanding. They're always doubting, do you love me? Do you care for me? If you don't return a call, why didn't you return my call? If you go away for a weekend, there's lots of mistrust. Did you meet someone? Have you spent time with someone? Lots of accusations. It's a bit narcissistic, if you will, not diagnostic, but trait-wise, that I'm only concerned with the fact that I feel okay in this relationship, and I can become controlling, anxiously controlling, anger controlling, and in fact can be quite vicious. But to bring that back to your question, can one style move into another? Absolutely. So if that individual enters into relationships with this overly needy, overly dependent, lack of healthy separateness, and it's met with more rejection or infidelity or abandonment or rejection, that pendulum can swing absolutely the other way, and they can decide, screw it, I don't need anybody. I'm just going to turn off that need, and I'm going to put my nose to the grindstone, and I'm going to focus on working in the library. And they turn off, or they try to turn off, their need for attachment. But most of us, Kristen, need attachment. I mean, there's one personality disorder that we refer to as schizoid personality disorder, and those folks seem to present with little or no need for attachment to anybody outside perhaps one primary caregiver. But for the rest of us, for the majority of us, I would say 99.9% of us, we do need attachment. We do need nurturing. We need attention and affection. We need a sense of admiration, appreciation, respect, a sense of belonging, a sense of mattering. So when we try not to need, it comes out sideways. It may come out with major depression. It may come out with generalized anxiety disorder. It can come out in a number of different mood disorders or dysfunctions. So to try to not need it is very destructive. The sad thing that we often see is that these two people find themselves or find each other, meaning the person with an anxious attachment style finds themselves with one with an avoidant attachment style, and they do a dance, which Pia Mellody refers to in her book Facing Love Addiction. I think she does a beautiful job of describing that, where one person is the pursuer and the other person has one foot out the door.
Right.
And oftentimes that is a dance that is shared, so we have the anxious individual, pursuing the avoidant, and then, the anxious person says, well, I'm not going to get it, so I'm out of here. They begin to avoid, and so the avoidant then puts on the anxious shoes and pursues the others. It's a very dysfunctional dance.
Yes.
Very dysfunctional dance. But the sad thing is that cornerstone to all of this is, how has the lack of a healthy attachment with my mother potentially affected a lifelong challenge of attaching to others.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and being able to unpack that and look at it is, it can be a really painful process, because along the way, there are probably some people that you've unintentionally hurt because you just couldn't attach in a healthy way.
Because of staying safe.
Yeah.
We spoke earlier about a silly little skill that I keep in the back pocket, and I shouldn't call it silly. It just kind of sounds funny, but the dynamic of feeling fact need, and what am I feeling as it relates to the situation, not necessarily a fact, but the important component there being what is it that I need. And it's my belief in what I practice and what I teach that the goal of relationship in almost every relationship, whether it's platonic, peer, family, romance, is connection and comfort. Oftentimes we see relationships functioning on fix or repair, or we've talked about control compliant dynamics. But I like to look at the dynamic or the goal of relationship being that of one of connection and comfort. And to secure that, bringing it back to feeling fact need, while it's important, very important for us to identify what we feel, I think that it's even more challenging for one recovering from growing up with a narcissistic mother to then be able to take that to the next level of identifying what do I need with regard to connection and comfort in relationship with other people. When I ask people that in my office, it's the deer in the headlight. They look at me like, what do you mean? What do I need? They have no concept. And, if we do not know what we need with regard to connection and comfort in relationships with others, our nurturing needs have little hope of being met, and a high likelihood of disappointment.
Yeah, I could see someone really getting comfortable with being isolated.
Because of the fear of communicating their needs, because of
that, but also just when you do that for a long time, you forget, what it's like to have attachment, or maybe you just never developed it, and so you get used to living that way, and the longer that you do it, the danger is that you'll stay there.
Hi, this is Dr. Paul Meyer of the Meyer Clinics. Our Christian counselors across the country have a goal of helping all those who come to us to become what God has called them to be. If you're in a situation where you're not at peace within yourself, or you just feel like there's joy that's missing in your life, we can come alongside to help you obtain peace and joy.
This message is sponsored by the Meyer Clinic Foundation, a nonprofit Christian counseling ministry. The number is 1-888-7-CLINIC, 1-888-7-CLINIC.
Well, stay there. And that's, when those people present themselves to therapy, is that they present themselves with depression, typically, major depression. I mean, one of the first things that I'm going to look at, when someone comes into my office in a first assessment is, so let's just say they present with, symptoms consistent with major depression. And, they'll describe to me their sadness, their depression, not being able to sleep, feeling dark, feeling lonely, not being able to enjoy, things that either they have typically enjoyed or what would be reasonable to enjoy, loss of motivation, to do things that they enjoy or that they're creative with, isolation, loss of appetite, use of substances, all of those things. One of the very first things I'm going to ask them is, who nurtures you? And I would feel safe to say that at least 80%, maybe 70%, but I would say near 80% of folks who are struggling with a mood disorder, when I ask them that question, there is significant deficit, meaning they're not being nurtured. And when I look at nurturing, I look at, this is going to sound clinical, and it is, but I look at our needs for attention, affection, time, a sense of safety and security. I chuckle because that's not present when we're growing up with a narcissistic parent. A sense of identity, that it's nurturing that your identity is separate from mine and mine is separate from yours, and they're both embraced. So we look at attention, affection, time, safety, security, identity. Where are your needs for admiration, appreciation, respect, sense of belonging, sense of mattering? How are those needs being met? And I kid you not, people, they look at me and they shake their heads. And I ask that question, quite purposefully, because it's my experience, in the years that I've been doing this, that it's nurturing deficits that then contribute to the mood disorder. So, when we've grown up in a family that has, or with a mother, where those needs have not been taught, validated, or met, we certainly can try to continue to live our life in that manner, but it catches up with us. It would be like trying to eat a diet void of protein. Right. Eventually our body's going to begin to break down.
What about people, because I've heard this from a lot of listeners on other podcasts, the other podcasts that I do, and they've talked about one of the things that was difficult for them is they just didn't want to be touched. They had a really hard time with hugging people, with any kind of physical touch from someone, because their mother was overly touchy with them. And some of them have described this feeling of their skin crawling every time their mother touched them. Because I think one person had said, I just felt like every time she touched me, she was sucking my soul. And so I just rejected her. And then they carried that into, other relationships where they just weren't comfortable being touched in that physical way.
I think that is a huge issue. And I use a rather nauseating term for that. And we see it, we know that narcissism in parenting, that there are no boundaries, that they bust boundaries left and right. But when I observe and work with folks who have that disdain for being touched, or that, there's no sense of where you end and where I begin, oftentimes what we're looking at is a presentation of what I call emotional incest.
Yes.
That there's, mom's needs. I was burdened by having to meet not only her expectations in my performance, but I had to keep her happy. I had to listen to her, disappointments with her sexual relationship with her partners. I needed to encourage her that her aging was going well. There was no room for me to be me. And so that lack of boundaries makes it incredibly difficult to be able to be touched. I think that it's important, though, to differentiate that as well, just for our listeners, that there is, on a bell-shaped curve, there is a bit of a variety with individuals' comfort with touch. But what you're talking about really is the creepy crawly disdain with, please don't get in my space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not being able to, you can give a hug to someone, that you've met or whatever, but with your closer friendships and stuff, just being a little uncomfortable with, touching your friend or patting them on the hand or whatever, because, with that kind of stuff was not healthy when you were growing up. There's that. And there's also this one that personally I experienced was anytime I had an accomplishment or I figured something out, I just didn't want her to know about it, because I felt like she just would take it and make it hers. And then it was no longer my accomplishment.
Oh, you didn't want to give her the power.
Yeah.
That was great. That was very creative.
Yeah, I mean, I would go speak, at 16 years old about sexual abuse in front of a room full of doctors and nurses. And I just didn't want to go home and tell her what I had done, because she would just get literally so dramatic, fall on her knees on the floor and go, oh, my daughter, look at what you've done. Oh, and it was just this. It made my skin crawl. And I was like, I'm not going to tell her anything that I do that's good, because it doesn't belong to her.
Well, and what I didn't hear you say is that she said, sweetheart, I'm so sorry that that's the story that you have to tell. My heart breaks. My heart breaks,
Never. That was never uttered.
What a concept, right?
No,
yeah.
What I heard from people constantly was my own therapist, which also was her therapist. That should have never happened.
Oh my. Not uncommon, though. Not uncommon with a narcissistic mom, because she wants to maintain control.
Absolutely. Yeah. And being thrown, it's nothing like being thrown under the bus by your own therapist for your mother. That's fabulous to go through. But to have people, school counselors call me in, and I'm so depressed I can't even function. And what I'm dealing with at home is my mother crying about her wounded childhood. Consequently, at the same time that I've said, this is what's going on with my dad. So I didn't actually get to be upset about what happened to me, because my mother was in the bathroom locked in the bathroom crying and screaming about her own abuse. And I thought it was rather convenient. And then going to school and having teachers say, or, a counselor at school say, can you just give your mother a break, Kristen? She is trying so hard.
Oh,
and
wow.
Knowing my past and going, what? Why share with anybody? Because it's all going to be about my mother.
Well, and I think that brings another point that is not necessarily with attachment, but that we see, it's not uncommon, for a teen, for instance, to come into therapy and for the parent to insist on being in sessions. That's my first indicator. That's my first indicator that we've got a narcissistic mom on board. But then they're not allowed to have a talk for themselves. And I'll give feedback to these parents that flat out that you're putting the children, let's just say, for example, as a pawn in a complicated divorce or parenting plan, and there is just little or no concern. And, when you speak of, people at school saying, give your mom a break, one thing that is important for people to remember is that narcissistic parents are good, meaning they shine in the legal system. They shine at school. They shine in the community. And the feedback that you clearly got there, and that I hear so often, is, why are you complaining? Look what she does for you. Everybody would want this lifestyle. She's having a hard time. Again, disregard your feelings. It's tragic. It's tragic.
And to me, that set up, attachment issues for me, because I didn't have anybody I could trust, or felt like I had anybody that I could trust, because she was always going to, quote unquote, win.
And so moving into relationships, how would you ever believe that someone would be interested in hearing if I was disappointed, or if I was upset, or I felt left out? We keep all of that inside. And that's where, And when I listen to you, and the more I get to know you, Kristen, I would say it takes one to know one. It appears, that you would lean more toward avoidant, than that anxious, that your strength, your one of your assets in your survival skills, your strength of trying not to allow it to affect you, is so much a part of, it sounds like so much a part of the many areas where you just, absolutely, soar. But we look at, when we're first entering into relationships, it really does interfere with us being able to attach, because we're the person who has it all together. We're the person who's there for everybody. We're the person who drops everything and helps, but we have no ability to ask for help when it's, 10:30 at night and 4 feet of snow and our tire's flat, right? We're like, okay, I'm sure I can change it. And it's only when we come to places like that we think maybe I need to look inside and see how I might grow and move outside my comfort zone.
Yeah, and you have to, learning how to ask for help is a huge part of this, because you're so uncomfortable with it. It just makes you so uncomfortable that I've had.
Well, and then that's where I think our therapist comes in, right?
Yes. Yes.
Folks. Yeah. Yeah.
I actually had a therapy session where I showed up. I really needed to go. There was a huge crisis, of course, because my life up until, a year ago was all about crisis management, and I was really good at it. But that's not been my life for the last year, which is fabulous. So I remember showing up to this therapist's office because something happens, man. I immediately, okay, let's go find a therapist and work on this. So I show up, and she was on a street that was very narrow, and I was driving a big Ford F-150 that had an extra long bed. And I had to, I passed her house because it was like the second visit there. And I had to turn, do this crazy turn to try to get back to her house. And one of the yards, like I backed my truck into these bushes thinking, oh, well, they're just bushes. But my truck, I didn't realize that there was a stone wall right behind the bushes. And then it was a straight dead drop into these people's backyard. To the point where had I kept going, my truck would have literally fallen straight up and down, and then probably would have fallen backwards upside down. So my truck, one of the tires went completely off this ledge, and I was sitting there, and I'm like, what do I do? I can get out of a crisis, and man, this is why I did 7 years of volunteer work in psych wards with my therapy dog, because boy, I get calm and everything. I could have been an emergency room person, but that's different than when you're the one that's sitting there and you've created something that you feel stupid about, or you are embarrassed about, you aren't being perfect, and then you've got to go ask someone for help. So anyway, eventually I called AAA, of course, and then these great neighbors came, and they just easily attached themselves to my truck and drove a Jeep and got me out and showed up in therapy. And the funny thing was, my therapist, because it was my second visit, she said, I absolutely know a lot about what we need to work on, and you're just one of those patients who you manifest exactly what you need to work on right before your eyes in physical action.
Well, that's brilliant. Or what I say, be careful of your greatest fear, because it has an uncanny ability to present itself.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, meaning in that situation, being dependent in what would appear to be a mistake. It's never safe to make a mistake as a child of a narcissist, right? And you drove off the road and now you need help. So humbling oneself as an error, that's huge.
Oh, I can go stop. I have been the person that, someone's having a heart attack and I pull over and I'm there and I'm helping them and I'm figuring everything out. But for me, it isn't that you can't get yourself out of the situation because you know how to do that. It's the embarrassment that you've done something wrong. Whereas somebody else would be like, oh, well, that was kind of dumb.
Well, yeah. Well, your sensitivity to the needs of others, comes from that hypervigilance of growing up with your mom. That compassionate heart, of wanting really to love on them in a manner that you've not been loved on, because it gives you a sense of warmth and connection.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that dangerously high pain tolerance puts you at risk of falling down the side of a hill. It's not good.
Exactly.
But it's those dynamics. It's those dynamics that interfere, and when we talk about attachment, really what we're talking about is that our attachment styles, our insecure attachment styles, ultimately interfere with our nurturing, ultimately interfere with us getting the ingredients, if you will, or the nutrients, I guess that would be the better word, to grow, to flourish, to thrive. And many folks spend a lifetime there. The interesting thing, though, is I find that with anxious or avoidant attachments, they generally ultimately erupt, so the anxious avoidant couple or the avoidant couple, typically they erupt and create tremendous dysfunction. You can see domestic violence, you can see all kinds of borderline behavior, all kinds of things can emerge because nurturing needs are not being met and unresolved trauma is being tapped into. But it's interesting, in my studies and in my walk, I've come across, this is a trait and this is not a diagnosis, but a doctor by the name of Craig Malkin, Malkin, has come up with, and I can't pronounce this correctly, Kristen, but I'll call it the ecoist. So it's ECHOIST, ecoist. But anyway, it's an interesting phenomena. And these people, unlike those who I believe have attachment challenges, rarely end up in therapy. Folks with attachment challenges or disorders, and I like not to call it a disorder because I tend to be avoidant, and I hope that I'm always working on it as a challenge of growth. So we're not going to call it, we're going to call it the challenge, the attachment challenge. But he talks about a phenomena, a trait dynamic, this ecoist, ECHOIST, where the individual is so terrified of looking narcissistic or so terrified of being like their mother that they completely go the other way. The pendulum swings. They hide in plain sight. They are absolutely, completely uncomfortable with any level of praise, of drawing any attention to themselves. And to be noticed, acknowledged, or felt special is terrifying for them. And so, typically they grow up in that narcissistic parent, but they're incredibly, I guess we would say, compliant. They learn to stay mum, as a child, and they learn to stay mum, meaning silent as an adult. And the sad thing, the basic, drive force behind this is they don't want to be a burden. They clearly were communicated as a child that they were nothing but a burden to their mother. And that costs them any ability to be loved. And so they try to avoid that. But the tragedy in it is that the individual is comfortable not having a voice, or so they think they are, or it's familiar, I guess is what we'd say. And they deny their needs and wants, and they're so eager to do for other people and to keep other people happy, but at the complete disregard for self. And their life is self-limiting. As long as they are keeping people happy and are there for other people, they feel safe. But sadly, what we see characterized by these folks, is chronic underachievement. They just do not acknowledge, look at their potential. They don't even entertain what their potential is with regard to, and I'm not talking success or degrees, I'm talking about connection and attachment, but that they're just compliant.
Interesting. That was something that I heard a lot about was, I did everything the opposite of my mother. I've heard that from a lot of listeners. And in some cases, some people that say that in their believing that they, didn't become all that they can't stand about their mother, they ended up being, of all their siblings, let's say they were the only one that made that statement, they ended up being the one most like mother in the end, the very one that they said, well, I did everything different.
You thought the pendulum swung to the other side.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and that's probably related to the fact that if there's not been that healing, that we've talked about, the steps involved in healing. Instead of healing, they take that survival mechanism, to another level, and they're so afraid of feeling special and so afraid of disappointment, and that they struggle with having their own voice. They often find themselves, not always, but they often find themselves with a narcissistic partner because that's something that they're familiar with, that they're comfortable with, and therefore they call it love. The sad thing is that, this quality trait, which Malkin refers to as an egoist, we might call it a passive avoidant personality, or passive avoidant traits. Sadly, they end up again on the receiving end, of abuse. and then feel like they're responsible for it. That I shouldn't have pushed them so far, or I shouldn't have asked for them to do that, and they blame themselves. And I always tell folks, that abuse is always, without a shadow of a doubt, abuse is always 100% the responsibility of the abuser. That it's not your fault, but they carry that dynamic into adulthood, and these folks are the ones who have not entered into that healing journey. And it's only when they begin to feel that lonesomeness or isolation that they can begin to look at it. And oftentimes they'll say, well, where do I begin, Lisa? How do I move forward with this? And I say, well, it's important to begin to allow yourself to feel the full spectrum of your emotions. It's okay to feel disappointment. It's okay to need to feel special. It's okay to have your own thoughts, your own feelings. It's okay to not be having a good day. They're so worried about being a burden to another person that there really is detachment from their needs and wants. And often they live a very lonesome life, but their nurturing need is met through the warmth, the love, the compliance that they give to other families and their other members of their family. And so, really, again, tracking back, I know we talked last time about, healing the wounds of a mother, and we talk about how it affects our attachment. That silly little phrase that I use, and I don't know where I picked it up, somewhere in my journey, of feelings, facts, needs, the most important component being, what is my feeling and what do I need? And how does that relate to connection and comfort in relationships? And if we look at that dynamic, what are my feelings and what do I need in order to experience connection with that feeling and comfort of that feeling, our attachment challenges will begin to emerge. We'll realize that we disregard our needs and wants, or we deny our feelings, and therefore we're not comforted and we don't experience connection. And to the extent that we do that, it interferes with nurturing. To the extent that we're not nurturing, it's like that protein deficit. It's going to show up eventually in our relationships and in our life.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, when we look at all of these dynamics and we look at, okay, I have grown up clearly with a pathological, mentally ill, abusive, narcissistic mother, and this is the roadmap, for my healing. And I'm taking a good look at where it's affected my ability to have healthy attachment and therefore healthy nurturing. What's so important for all of us to realize is that this is where therapy comes in, that this is not the rest of our life, that we can heal these wounds. We can find healthy attachment. We can find healthy nurturing. We can heal from the trauma. And so when we think about, it's overwhelming, to come to the place of entering to this journey, but all it takes is desire. And if we enter into that process and we invest our time with a therapist and are reparented or remothered by a combination of our therapist and maybe moving into other safe relationships, then we can find those things that are necessary to live a healthy, fulfilling, well-balanced life. And I think that's where I absolutely feel blessed to be able to be a part of that journey with so many people, Kristen. Often I just say, thank you so much, Lord, for letting me be a part of the healing process, because over and over and over and over and over and over again, I see, watch, and walk with many people on this path, and they find freedom. And that makes it all worthwhile. So thank you for bringing these shows, to the awareness of so many people, and for you sharing, Kristen, all of your journey and the full meal deal of both mom and dad, and yet where you are and where you aspire to be and how you gift that out of the compassion of your heart for other people is truly, for me as an outsider and a co-host, it moves me. So thank you. Thank you.
I can take a compliment, so thank you.
You bet.
Yeah, what's the point if you're not gonna for me, I don't say other people need to be this way, but I have to take these things and turn them into potential healing, maybe for somebody else. So that's what's helped me get through it, get through this stuff, really, is interviewing as many people like you as possible, and being so open about talking about mental health, and being vulnerable. That's a key that a lot of people need to get to. So anyway, I want to thank you for doing this. This was a 3-part series. I'm sure it will come up again, but the first one was growing up with a narcissistic mother. And then our second show was healing the wounds of growing up with a narcissistic mother. And our third that we just completed today is how growing up with a narcissistic mother affects your attachment styles. Dr. Lisa Day, thank you so much for doing this 3-part series on narcissistic mothers. A lot of great information, and I'm excited to see what our topic is going to be next time.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for letting me share this journey with you. It's pretty fun, pretty awesome.
Yes, it is. And thank you to our listening family for tuning in, and we will catch you next time.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. Tune in next time for another engaging discussion on relevant mental health topics. If you have any questions about Meyer Clinics, please visit our website at meyerclinics.com. That's MEIER clinics.com, or call us at 888-7-CLINIC. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or any of your favorite podcast apps. And please note that we are a member of and produced by Mental Health News Radio Network, MHNRnetwork.com.